Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Bulgaria and more specifically of the times of Boris I, Simeon I, and the spread of Bogomilism until essentially the conquest of subjugation of Bulgaria by Basil II. I've already made several videos about medieval Bulgaria at this point, especially about the First Bulgarian Empire that is standing in the centuries. Today we talk essentially about the 9th and the 10th century until, in fact, the beginning of the 11th, with some, further considerations about Bogomilism, Khazarism until the 12th in a more international way. But let's say we have already observed and laid the foundation to, in this channel, the sort of a good introduction to the First Bulgarian Empire, not just from the Bulgarian side, that I would like actually to talk about more. In fact, this video is sort of recap, but also looking at things that we haven't really considered, at least from certain perspectives and so on, but also from the Byzantine point of view, right, which is crucial in this relation, because as you know, until Basil II was this, throughout the all the existence of the so-called First Bulgarian Empire, this a looming threat from this northern force on the same Constantinople, right, very close geographically, within the same trace, basically. And so in this divide, essentially, between a sort of Greek Mediterranean area and a Slavic, at this point especially, fully under the Bulgars of mainly Turkic origin, in the Balkan hinterland, right? And it's a lot of stuff, because Bulgaria, especially through the official Christianization under Boris, and the further expansion under his son Simeon, essentially affirmed itself as a major Christian power that produced also an incredible cultural output that would influence the entire Slavic world as far as the development, in fact, of properly a Slavic script, the old Slavonic, right, ecclesiastical script, for the evangelization, in fact, of many other peoples in the Balkans, in Central and Eastern Europe that were still pagan, and that would turn first in the Glagolitic, and then Cyrillic, the latter of which had essentially emerged after Glagolitic existed in parallel with that, but essentially taking over, as you know, the script of most, in fact, of this, say, we can call, broadly speaking, the eastern half of Europe till to our days. And there is so much about this whole thing for a number of reasons. We'll list now. Already made videos about the Byzantine evangelization of these various peoples, including the Bulgarians, the connections existing with Great Moravia, with later, exactly in this years, that's with Simeon having to fight against the Magyars that would settle Pannonian base, and the other populations as far as Kiev and beyond that were influenced by this Bulgarian model that was very meaningfully, for the first time, posing itself as a true counterpart in a serious power capable even of threatening and possibly ousting the same Roman one in Constantinople, right? And this is, I think, a very important change, because we already witnessed other great powers like the Avar one that at this point had been wiped out by the Carolingians after a substantial crisis, of which also the Bulgarians took advantage, because basically at this point it was really not even a true limit right now to the Bulgarian and Frankish sphere of influence, until they overlapped, right, in that area that would be eventually filled once again by yet another step people, the aforementioned Magyars. We're talking, as we were saying before, about a truly Slavic power. By this point, again, the Bulgars, I will have to make some videos about this, were mainly of Turkic origin, but they were Indo-Europeans. If you look at their stelae when they settled down, in Thrace, in this broader area, also across the Danube. Their power mostly based in the south, and now we will explain also obviously why, because that's the only place where it could be sustained with those solid, sedentary, concentrated bases. But you see both also this Iranian tongue, etc. But of course, majority of the populations ruled were Slavic or Slavicized, plus all what had existed historically in these regions ethnically before to make up this. In the video about the First Bulgarian Empire, we've seen how, after all, fragile, of course, these political constructions really were. I mean, this was a new power that, as many others, was strong, threatening, menacing, as far as it could combine tradition with modernity. In this case, tradition was the historically tribal, sort of warlike and even semi-nomadic, to some extent, dimension of the Balkans. Modernity was the Byzantine model in the form of a urban civilization, bureaucracy, right? Central bureaucracy, a professional military, right? There was much in between because, of course, there was even this promiscuity, especially between the Byzantines and the Bulgarians, as far as now we will see it, the cultural models that were shared, because we're so close after all. It doesn't matter how substantially different these worlds were, given their background, but they would obviously permeate one another indissolubly to some extent. But it's just like the others, right? At the beginning, they settled down, they managed to concentrate power during their heyday, but after all, they decline. The Bulgarian Empire is sort of more resilient and even more threatening, in part because it's closer to Constantinople, and so that's the obvious goal, right? The Bulgarians would have liked to essentially literally conquer Constantinople like anyone, but as far as their practical policy that they arrived to acquire, especially at this time of Simeon, for example, it was the first titled Tsar of the Caesar, the actual emperor of the Bulgarians. In fact, a literal parallel to the Byzantine one, and so historically, literally putting himself at the same level of the ecumenic empire that was still recognized to an important extent. We explained how, in spite of the important contraction that the Byzantine Empire had undergone in the previous centuries, in the early Middle Ages, of course, everybody in Europe really realized that this was the Roman Empire. I mean, it's not just like they saw it as another power among the many. There is a lot of sort of national subjectivism when it comes to this, thinking that in the High Middle Ages you had an option in considering who was the actual universal empire, but you have, at this point in the 10th century, the title of, not even of imperator, but specifically of basileus, boasted by even some Anglo-Saxon rulers, right, to say how strong actually the Byzantine influence really was. When we look at Boris I, Simeon I, we're looking at actually still the existence of the Carolingian Empire, not even Simeon died before the Ottonians had come to power, and even decades before they would actually be crowned Roman emperors in the urbs themselves. So it's a very fascinating time, but the spaces are also crucial to understand in the process. And the Bulgarians came close to represent themselves in that sort of alternative imperial authority to the same Constantinople as a sort of twin empire. Yet another very important aspect of this is the connection with Rome. At this point, in spite of the contrasts that had been existing exactly in these years between the Pope and the Constantinopolitan Patriarch Photius, the church was not yet divided, right? It was still one. It's technically always been that, but of course at some point there was a schism that was intended by different chunks of it as, of course, in different ways. And the Bulgarians had been playing this card together with other Balkan peoples, such as the Croatians, that eventually would go on, of course, to be fully Catholic, right, differently from the Serbians, for example, to even, however, accept the, in fact, the papal blessing, right? The idea was, at this point, there was a huge competition. Again, we made lots of videos about this. If you go into medieval Christianity playlist, but if you look at medieval Bulgaria, I already made something about this. For, in fact, the evangelization of these peoples in the Balkans, in Central and Eastern Europe. Rome actually won the race. At least the Byzantines were to content themselves with sort of more peripheral peoples. That could be great empires, like the Bulgarian one, or, if you look at the Kievan Rus, or the Khazars, but in an area of Europe that was definitely not destined to blossom as much as the Western, the Central one. And so, because also of different, essentially what Byzantine culture was really compared to the Latin Germanic one, the latter, which was actually much more thriving already at this point, or at least had a much greater, let's say, expansional capacity. Right, the Byzantines were doing great things at the same time. You can basically put them in parallel, but I know that lots of people rightfully love the Byzantine history as much as I could. I remember when I was at university, I always chose Byzantine history classes whenever I could in the optional modules of the curriculum, because it's just very important and underrated, but you shouldn't be blinded by that just in a sort of fanboyistic fashion to pretend that whoever out there was a barbarian, right? There were actual barbarians in a way, but definitely the Latin Germanic word was not that, and it already displayed certain very striking civilizational capacities that by the 12th century at the latest had essentially already surpassed Constantinople, right, and to a really significant degree. The Bulgarians would end up in the so-called Orthodox sphere anyway, because it was just more convenient for the proximity of Constantinople, the influence of the Greek Church, of just the evangelization, just the same missionaries. I mean, the people that were, in fact, the famous Cyrillus and Methodius were emerging really from Thessaly, that was in this frontier area between the Byzantines and Bulgaria, right? What was controlled by Bulgaria, that, as you can see also from the map, was actually a huge amount of land. Again, it was not a dramatically centralized power. The core of it was fundamentally south, on the right bank of the Danube, right? Simeon the Great extended at this point some control over Serbia, etc., but in a decentralized fashion, right? Also, what was in the north of the Danube, you have the Carpathian Basin, and in the east, basically the steppe, was nominally under the Bulgarians, but never truly controlled, right? And the reason why it was that attractive, after all, was just the mineral resources of that hinterland. There were skirmishes also between the Bulgarians and the Carolingians in the Pannonian area. The two empires were too far away to clash, but there were interesting sort of policies, right? That were ever changing, depending on whichever thing, whatever, faction was prevalent in Rome, the one supporting, say, Western French as opposed to the Eastern one, what the Byzantines were doing, doctrinally, what in fact was happening within Bulgaria. Bulgaria, that was, without mentioning the various semi-nomadic peoples that arrived cyclically from the steppes, yet to create another problem in an incredibly inaccessibly messed up situation in the first place. Welcome to high medieval history, and especially the Danubian Valley in that case. And lots of wars, needless to say. But as we were saying before, it doesn't matter how sort of imitative the Bulgarian Empire was towards Constantinople, with for example, the splendid capital Preslav, that was sort of the other Constantinople, the other Rome, the other Aachen, right? A city built in actual stone, something that in most of Europe was not even like just, the Roman ruins were about that. And but exemplifying that model of power was so seductive for, of course, the Bulgarian Tsars at this point to truly aim also dynastically with marriages with the with the Byzantine princesses born in the power pole, etc. That legitimacy as actual Roman emperors, that is basically what everybody was sort of coveting from themselves, that the Byzantines were rightfully and extremely jealous of, and very careful in not conferring many ways, aside from all the mess up things that happened because of the internal issues within the same empire. So this was the pretense, especially of Simeon I, that was really the strongest ruler in the First Bulgarian Empire. He was the son and successor of Boris the First. Simeon is known also as the Great for this reason. Between the 9th and the 10th century, not only he led the Bulgarian domination to its greatest extent, but he was also highly educated, as he had been, in fact, brought up in Constantinople according to the modules of that very specific religious and literary tradition, in fact, that we call Byzantine, that heavily affected his, let's say, the transformation, say, of Bulgarian society within the new religious frame given by Boris with the conversion to Christianity, but also to the literal multiplication of churches and monasteries that, as you know, were part of this massive, unprecedented asset that was trying to be, in fact, now put together, concentrated for imperial authority, but also the local Bulgarian nobility, as it was going on. Like, if you look at what was happening in Western Europe, like at this time, it's the heyday of the actual foundation and privatization, especially of churches and monasteries, with bishops being extremely powerful, the monastic fabric being the one that kept, in that case, Western Europe together. In this Balkan region, things were going on in a different way. It was much less sort of potential to concentrate power in that regard, but the power, especially the military one, boasted by Simeon, doesn't matter how temporary, because there would be different dynastic crises, sort of, again, this further privatization, clienteling systems that didn't really work to the full statalization of the empire, would remain sort of just, in fact, a centralistic attempt. There were still pagans, actually, within the Bulgarian nobility that didn't quite like this, or at least were simply countering this more powerful imperial dynasty, trying to actually become the same and then convert it into Christianity, because that's what it would boil down to as elsewhere. And this work is extraordinary. I mean, again, for the times and places, for example, all the great cultural work of enormous, by the way, activity of translation, right, from in fact, Greek to Old Church Slavonic, the elaboration, even critically, of Greek religious texts, was all carried out under the edges of this great ruler, right, who scored. I mean, Boris is quite famous because of this sort of step, like, into Christendom. Simeon is important for the consolidation of that, and especially his great military victories. I mean, there were ups and downs depending on the situation. Nothing was easy, but again, the greatest extent of Bulgarian power territorially occurred under him, right? And then things went downhill, basically. I mean, they took a while before, of course, this First Bulgarian Empire fully fragmented, but we have seen in the dedicated video how this internal process of consolidation was just being attempted here, right? It had never been fully sort of a Bulgarian state that you could truly parallel to the one of Constantinople, right? And in fact, this is what strikes you the most about the Simeonian era, right? That this work of acculturation, especially through the foundation of churches and monasteries, you know that the same capital, Preslav, it went eventually in decline. I mean, you can admire sort of rise and fall of this Bulgarian civilization because of it's just, I don't know, during the same Viking era, you have very important centers that were not as developed as Bulgaria, by the way, but just for the sake of example, trade markets were just active because of Viking slave trade that were essentially the largest settlements in Scandinavia, and that basically died out. They didn't have any urban continuity in the following centuries. They remained there. Here there is something similar. There's a very speedy growth and equally unstable foundations that reveal that sort of insecurity. It's a bit like, the St. Carolingians had operated in a way like that too, albeit again yet in another context, made lots of videos about the Carolingian Empire and the Carolingian Church. There is a dedicated playlist to that in the first place. But the result of it was a sort of sudden ecclesiastical power in Bulgaria, permeated of Greekness, essentially, of Greek culture, right? Just like in the West, I don't know, the Germans had essentially began to legislate in Latin to eventually be absorbed by the Romance majority. Here you have something actually slightly more complex, meaning that Greek was again the culture of this great Byzantine civilization that, however, didn't mingle, because just like from classical times, the Greeks stayed in their coastal cities. They couldn't care less, culturally speaking. They were completely alien to their culture, mentally or cognitive means, the idea that there was another world outside of that. And the Bulgarians were Slavs instead. And so here you have a sort of different cycle, sort of different systems of cultural absorption. The reason I was telling you before that why the Bulgarian Empire was essentially based in the Balkans is that this area, doesn't matter how depopulated it had become during the early Middle Ages, it had, however, hosted at some point in history an actual civilization. I mean, the area of Mysia, for example, had historically been just where the Romans could sustain with enough agricultural resources, a full Romanization. The reason actually why part of that Slavic world was actually closer to Latin Europe than Greek one is quite fascinating, especially across the Balkan Mountains, right? You can find still in the local idioms today, in Serbian, etc., a distinct Latin influence that is sort of stronger in certain cases than the Greek one, because again they had the Latin and Greek had been spread in two completely different ways historically, and not just in two completely different areas. Hence the same connections with Rome that was trying again to convert the Western Balkans, also successfully speaking, and even convincing at some point the Bulgarians to cooperate and to even think to obey Rome and not Constantinople. Ecclesiastically speaking, but again, the latter connection would eventually win, right? But the interesting aspect of this ecclesiastical spread in Bulgaria is the sort of political and social portents of the same, because as we were indicating before, in a way or another, such ecclesiastical and monastic foundations were fundamentally of, say, the appanage and actual property, right, of the Bulgarian nobility to some extent, right? The reason why the church, of course, the Christianization of Europe passes through the affirmation of greater concentrated power and actual statehood is that, of course, churches were provided with an with ecclesiastical privileges in the first place. Same goes for with the monasteries. They were permanent infrastructures that really served the purpose of storing power for someone to concentrate further of that. Hence, you would see, like, I don't know, in Scandinavia, some eventual state monarchy developed from there. Bulgaria would eventually be destroyed in practice as a state by the Byzantines, so things would sort of degenerate historically. I sort of made a video about videos about, for example, the Second Bulgarian Empire, also especially after the destruction of the Byzantine one after the Fourth Crusade, and so paradoxically even the westernization and feudalization of Bulgaria to some extent. At least this happened also in the Greek lands, but never to that fullest. The lack of a proper heraldry also at the end of the Middle Ages made a bit about that in the Balkans, compared to, say, the Serbian one was sort of much more defined. So it's very difficult to make a full history of the lineages, even of the ethnicity, right? Think about the Second Bulgarian Empire is sometimes described properly as a Bulgarian, but also Black and Kuman one, right? Because of all what was going on at the time. Naturally, it never re-achieved the same power and prestige that the first one in the early and high Middle Ages had. But the meaning behind this Christianization, the foundation of these various institutions, was the one of establishing an aristocracy, right? An oligarchy that could maintain power in the region and hopefully bringing this power to the next stage, right? Now, the interesting thing about this, as you can also understand from the title, is that this, especially the social implications of these, partly also the political one, but mainly the social one, is that this came to create a divide between the elite and the majority of the population. I mean, historically, in these non-statalized lands, actually, you find it easier, right? As in some parts of the West, historically, the decline of the Roman institutions, etc., the affirmation of a sort of feudal aristocracy of some sort. The Bulgarians, paradoxically, do not have an orderly and concentrated power enough to even develop properly a feudal monarchy like the ones that were developing with all their time, though, in post-Carolingian Europe. But they still, of course, were quite stratified society, right? Quite unequal ones, right? You had this, historically, this nomadic people that had arrived with all that sort of, in fact, steppe autocratic model that was the most traumatically violent and brutal thing that you can imagine. I mean, literally, it's just like what happened in Eastern Europe after the Mongols, right? It's not a European model anymore. I mean, I don't know, the Tsarist aristocracy is a purely Mongol product. And before the Rus was a completely different thing, much more similar to Central Europe. The Bulgarians, as the Hungarians later, historically, would maintain a bit of this, again, autocracy, but together with all the problems deriving from that sort of more privatistic and not really statalistic system. The idea is that already at this time, between the 9th and 10th century, yes, you don't have a state, really. It doesn't matter how hard the Tsars of Bulgaria tried to imitate, to copy, to spread the Byzantine model. There was also not pure state at this point, telling the truth. The word was definitely going, see, the Latin Germanic one, the Byzantines, even the Arabs, towards sort of greater feudalization, privatization at least. But, of course, the powerful clans that had been ruling as conquerors, doesn't matter how also blended with local population, married into them, etc., had maintained this sort of mentality, right? The way the state existed in some form was, of course, also based on the traditionally predatory sort of character spirit of the same Bulgars of the early day. I mean, every time there was a problem in the Byzantine Empire that was naturally richer, more developed, populated, was the Balkan rulers to descend from the local valleys towards the Aegean, raiding, plundering, taking slaves, etc. And this happened like all the freaking time, regularly. As soon as there was a crisis, the first thing you imagine, where is in the north? This happened later on. It happened with the Avars, with the Bulgarians, with the Serbians, with the Hungarians. Every freaking damn time, there was a raid right across these valleys, and there wasn't quite, also because it was carried out sometimes by not just massive armies. At some point there were attempts, as you know, to conquer the same Constantinople by besieging it, the Theodosian wolves making their job until 1453. Actually 1204, but in that case it wasn't much the destruction of the wolves, rather the fact that the Crusaders were let in. Also in 1453 to some extent, but let's not digress on this. You would have different bands carrying this out. Very often, also, without a real permission from the greater authority. Here we're talking about the Bulgarian Empire, Tsars, etc., very high-sounding terms, but the concrete political and social reality of this system, as dispersive and also devoid of a true frontier to some extent, aside from the ethnic core land of the Bulgarians, it was very unruly, right? It's the same reason why eventually the system collapsed to some extent and privatized and sort of entrenched seigneurially in all these various valleys and areas that were very difficult even to reach, as you know, right? The Byzantines were sort of helpless at some point. They could reach even the Danube, trying to recontrol fortresses like Belgrade and Sirmium, Niš, Vidin, etc. But the actual deal was that you couldn't quite control all the nightmarish, to say the least, Balkan hinterland. That is a place where you do not want to be in any way, in any sort of military context. And by the way, never commit the childish mistake of considering yourself more intelligent or more capable than a 7th century Bulgar horseman. The idea is that this system is ruled by a ruthless military aristocracy that, of course, doesn't give a damn about anyone. These people are completely full of, the traditional notion, even as the Tsars, of the, of course, traditional imperial Catholic tradition, as far as that sense of greatness, of accomplishment, of heroic divine attainment, that radically and racially discriminates between the elite and the lesser people, right? Especially also in this case, considering that the majority of the commoners were Slavs, and there was this sense of, again, maybe it was not true biologically, but it was important to trace your origins back to the idea of the ancient Bulgar clans, where it's like a bit like the Polish Szlachta claiming to be Sarmatians, Iranians, not Slavs, or the same Magyars. Also, Hungary is, yes, it's the language is Ugro-Finnic, but a great part, at least, of the population was of Slavicized origin. So the foundation of ecclesiastical and monastic institutions has actually a very traumatic impact on this Slavic peasantry, or the Bulgarian peasantry in the first place, right? Just like in the Byzantine Empire, but things had changed a bit after the iconoclasm, monasteries, and just like, again, in Latin Germanic Europe, again, were a power to be reckoned with. They had a quasi-seigneurial power of the rest of the population. I mean, they literally owned people working in the fields for them, and in part the clienteles of these institutions maintained control, especially when they were connected with, in fact, these lay founders that were just by themselves more powerful, like affluent enough to even found a monastery that by these times and places was a shocking amount of wealth that cannot even properly quantified in some circumstances. And so, when we look at the spread of later Bogomilism in the Balkans, we actually realize that far from being, in fact, sort of a national character of the local, and this is how history, unfortunately, is interpreted in a way or another, it was actually a deeply social implication, meaning that, in this case, Bogomilism, and so the Paulician heresy, and so this at best heterodox Christianity would not open, in fact, heresy, because there is some, we'll talk about it now, it's some of an ambiguity, because, I don't know, it's not that we have a very good documentation about 19th century Bulgaria in the first place, but was spreading as essentially Gnosticism, agnostic heresy, among the peasantry against these Bulgarian elite ecclesiastical institutions. Right. Now, I made multiple videos on Catharism and literally described what this was, say, without descending into theological details, that literally, it's essentially a dualism, right? It's a dualistic heresy that states that fundamentally everything is a scam, that, it becomes complex. We don't know fully even what these branches of Gnosticism technically believed, because eventually they were, unfortunately, also wiped out by the Catholic Church, meaning the true Catholic one, even the Byzantine Orthodox one. Just to make a note, the Bogomils were the only ones who forced the Byzantines into a crusade. I mean, for the Byzantines, the very concept of crusade was absolutely, totally alien to anything belonging to their culture. But in the case of the Bogomils, they had to carry out one because of the problems that they posed. And of course, these people were massacred. And this entailed, in part, of course, also a repression from the side of the elites. But the point, in fact, being exactly this, that while the elites were, of course, cultivating a healthy, a transfigurational, of course, synthesis between the spirit and the flesh, so the capacity of redeeming the material part of the world rather than rejecting it, right? Like the Gnostics that just instead passively let life dying without accomplishment, basically thinking just that there will be a God that will save them anyway without them doing nothing completely. And that's, of course, a fourth estate ideology. In fact, the Bogomils were the usual, again, lesser people that are socially envious and don't care anything about civilization, reason, human dignity, intelligence, merit, any form of disciplined accomplishment that has to elevate them from just being themselves without any merit or value, humanly speaking. And so, in fact, the most fringe sort of, isolated, impervious areas of the Balkans, this virus spread, right, and affirmed itself in a dynamic that is also reminiscent of what would happen later, in fact, with the same Catharism, etc. The Paulician heresy was of Armenian origin, but generally speaking, Gnosticism, as you know, had been around since ever, everywhere. I mean, the same St. Augustine was actually a Gnostic. There was every time, again, from a certain background, there is a level of populistic degeneration. You always find this uncompromised, hypocritical, self-sabotaging, unaccomplished mentality that has to essentially go against whoever has merit, power, actually runs things. And as a consequence, again, in this particularly underdeveloped areas of Europe, in the Balkan hinterland, again, this thing would spread, right? But not without some sort of previous wealth, right? This movement would have not had its even its mention, its actual reactivation, if it hadn't been some degree of fair balance, but among some farmer, someone that, thanks to the power maintained by the Tsars at some point, had managed to spend time doing this stuff rather than just trying to survive. Right? There had already been some of these heresies in the Byzantine world from quite a while, and the idea is that Bogomilism spread during the High Middle Ages from the Balkans, Bulgaria, but then Dalmatia, Bosnia, Croatia, into eventually Western Europe. And the most developed areas of that, because there were lots of course of commoners who were gravitating parasitically around the largest centers, like the richest areas, the richest cities, especially in Lombardy, in Occitania, in the Rhineland. They arrived up to Britain, etc. I mean, it was essentially a populistic movement. Right? It's the complete rejection of standards, just like the one you see today, right? The fact that essentially you want just to hate even sexual differences. You turn vegan, you have communistic tendencies. This is all what Catharism was fundamentally about, Gnosticism was fundamentally about. Again, I made videos explaining this again, and you can sort of check this out. Of course, it was in part manipulated, just like, I don't know, a communist terroristic group can do today, right? Living in utter misery in some peripheral area and trying to create problems with guerrilla, with resistance, all this stuff, which the Balkan hinterland was very well suited for, and in fact brought this phenomenon to remain alive to some extent for centuries before some other order came around. This is sort of part of the high medieval revival, right? The Byzantine world was re-expanding. Bulgaria, by osmosis, was doing the same, and so you have this well-off, sort of this greater wealth spreading, for which, again, people start to think that they could even move themselves against the elite, but eventually, of course, fail, because this area would never seen, of course, significant popular communal development whatsoever. It wasn't just like any political, social precondition for that. But it arrived earlier, right? And the ideologies, the ideology involved is just the one seen in other similar forms of Manichaeism, the exasperated opposition to the evangelical morale, right? For which everything physical, material, any good, any property, any sexual difference. Think about, leftism today. This is literally and foundational, the doctrinal hardcore of a millenary ideology that has nothing to do with today's invention. It's always been around. It's just a cult of, the Dionysian, telluric, feminine, anti-virile, Apollonian, Uranian cult, right? That was trying to reemerge from the lower classes, the ones that literally live in the dirt. And that in fact was looking at any sort of power possession, including these major estates and of the monasteries and the church, as evil, right? So the idea that matter is purely demonic, that we should hate our own bodies and destroying them, because any form of that is evil. There is essentially, the dualistic heresy stands in the fact that there is, not like in the imperial Catholic tradition, God and the absence of it, right? So life and nothing. But in fact, the superstitious personification of an alter God, that in fact would be the one of just the material side of the story, of the earthly dimension, that would trick people. And this is, again, incredibly, ignorant, because of course the entire elite, the establishment, was all about the self-sacrifice in holy combat, the exasperation of the spiritual dimension as well, but would never dream, of course, of saying that matter is evil, because their first purpose was to win matter, to transfigure it, and to elevate it into the divine standard. Instead, of course, those who cannot afford that will just spit on any sort of merit and capacity that God gives you to actually bring matter to one, and so concentrated through wealth in that divine glory control provided. And this denies lots of things, including, of course, the incarnation of Christ. So it basically denies the human merit whatsoever in transfiguration. Basically, it says that you alone cannot do anything. It's sort of, again, it's the usual anti-Catholic the mental illness. It's the sense of God will save you without you having to do anything but die, right? Or wishing for being saved, right? And not accomplishing anything in the first place. And living in utter misery for that matter. Again, a world dominated by evil, allegedly residing within the same ecclesiastical institutions, were, in spite of the objective difficulties that we listed before, making a sort of an orderly state out of the Bulgarian establishment, actually, however, succeeding to some extent in actually bringing order within, a provincial dimension that in the Balkans by itself was already a huge deal, right? There was a sort of, it's obvious that in all this there was also an anti-Byzantine feeling, because of course the Bulgarian elite was trying to become Roman as well. So all these people were trying again to buy ever more in the imperial and Catholic tradition. And there was here the usual Balkan resistance against the more civilized outer land that, of course, was also devoid of any particular ideology at some point. I mean, Bogomilism was not universal among the commoners. There was actually a sort of a obvious resistance that some communities would just oppose to any kind of power re-expansion in the area. So it's always complex just to cut the stuff short. I mean, it's like just was saying before about the pagans and the Christians, right? As long as it was convenient for you to, Christianity and Orthodox in the sense were the hallmark of the elite, right? Until you were counter-elite, you would back the opposite. Paganism, even heresy, right? As long as you came into power, you would buy fully Christianity and Orthodox. That's how, of course, it always worked. Of course, there were still considerations from the old pagan background of the Bulgar elite that had, like in the steppe world, was was very oligarchic, in the sense that there was a very heavy certification for which nobody literally cares anything about. The lesser people, but among oligarchs, stresses this idea of egalitarianism, for which no ruler has to emerge over the others. It's the same reason why basically the entire east half of Europe historically failed to develop national monarchy, because the noblemen basically aborted the state and basically brought to the disintegration of any possibility of affirming itself as an actual power. I mean, there weren't local resources. These were less densely populated, worse connected, sort of just less agriculturally prosperous areas. So everything was more complicated. But it's really remarkable to observe the Bulgarian accomplishment as far as, again, this sort of alter imperium was concerned. And the rulers were quite smart and skilled, etc., but they couldn't at some point make miracles. Bogomilism was in a way a counter movement to this. It obviously mirrored a social protest against this nobility affirming itself. In part it was fair, like you could be a Bogomil having some sort of actual, Catholic concerns unbeknownst to you by fighting under this banner, but really wanting greater standard from the same elites, not to destroy just the basis that they had to rule on, because of the ferocious nature, again, of steppe authoritarianism that the local elites had quite quite much adopted, and it's the same reason why, they had always had and spread even among the Slavic ones at this point in charge in the area. But still, it sort of, in this theology of dualistic orientation, was expressing a malaise, right? Even some ethnic tension. The idea that, here we're talking about Bulgarians, but there wasn't a truly and fully sort of accepted reality for which Bulgaria was seen as an homogeneously uniform ethnic national reality. And of course the fact that these nomads arrived from God knows where had been imposing themselves historically on the more peripheral Slavic mountaineer communities had a role in this sort of resistance. So it's a blend of all these factors. And this is in part also the reason why the proselytism of the Bogomils was remarkable also outside of the Bulgarian world. Both among the other southern Slavs, as we've seen before in Bosnia and in Croatia, and in the same heart of the Byzantine Empire, right? It had notoriously, as Manichaeism, Gnosticism, repercussions in the later Middle Ages in more parts of Europe. You can't quite see any, this. You can't see this historically as a dualistic heresy till to this day, right? The attempt to stem any kind of imperial Catholic tradition for the etymological meaning of the same words and the theological one. In other words, going in the opposite sense that God's unity really indicates, because just you're degenerating to a degree you can't quite recognize even what's the way to salvation and the direction you should follow for the leaders to try even to regain that sort of divine standard. So this issue went on to affect the same Byzantine Empire, because as we were explaining before, not just these Bogomils in Bulgaria were preventing this sort of Byzantinization of the same Bulgaria. The Bulgarians hoped to take over Constantinople, but Constantinople was granting, again, this imperial titles, the sort of liturgical sort of concessions, prerogatives, ecclesiastical immunities and autonomies, etc., to the same Bulgarians in order to absorb them, because they sort of saw still the Bulgarians are yet, and as always in the imperial Catholic tradition, is yet one people that has to be under the ecumenic universal empire, right? So the Bulgaria, this area of the Balkans, became a nest for these Gnosticism to spill over back into the Byzantine Empire, where we have seen this had fundamentally come from. And so going against, within the same Byzantine Empire, the same Macedonian dynasty, made multiple videos about the Macedons during this period in Byzantine imperial revival. So basically creating tensions by even supporting raids again in the Byzantine Empire. As I was telling before, there were some, again, Bulgarian noblemen that, albeit again, being the same founders of churches and monasteries, were against the centralizing policy of the Tsars, and so they were backed by the same Bogomils to launch raids and to even try to, into the Byzantine Empire, but at the same time to sort of tear apart the same Tsarist system. And this was, of course, troubling the same Byzantine Empire. It had all a massive political and military implication. Strategically, the Bulgarian problem was loaded with this constant agitations, right? Because all the Byzantines wanted at the end of the day was to co-opt the Bulgarian aristocracy throughout the aforementioned mechanism so that they could control them better and so eventually re-Byzantinize and sort of take over the system, which is actually what happens, at least in part, under Basil II between the end of the 10th and the beginning of the 11th century. I made actually multiple videos about Basil II, but one especially talking about the cost of the expansion under him, and especially in function of the Bulgarian theater that was so this decades of prolonged warfare with lots of with a great cost, in fact, of reversals, issues, resistance, etc. So that even if we know how Basil II, that was nicknamed later Bulgar Octonus because of the fatal blow inflicted to the Bulgarian Empire and the biblical bath of blood of Bulgarian enemies, did not quite succeed in taking over politically and territorially the entire Bulgaria. I mean, the Bulgarian Empire was destroyed, and Bulgaria in this sense failed also as a national reality to recompact on the basis that these early and very successful and very fearsome and authoritative rulers had managed to accomplish, because basically, again, this movement self-sabotaged the plan from the within, but at least, right, the empire was freed from this looming threat of the Bulgarians that came to be a problem only after 1204, when the Byzantine Empire was destroyed, and so the Palaiologians had to basically recope with, eventually, even when they reconquered Constantinople, with the Bulgarians as an actual, threat. The same Latins were defeated by the Bulgarians. That's how basically declined as well. The problem with the land, again, is that you can't quite centralize from there, just like the Bulgarians hadn't succeeded. The medieval powers hadn't quite the capacity to simply rebuild civilization into the Balkans out of scratch. Right? This was, again, a deeply different world. Just even a few tens of miles in the interland, right, compared to the Byzantine coastal dimension, to actually even hope, like, and again, the Greek mentality was completely alien to the concept of trying to re-Hellenize or re-Romanize the interland, right? They just wanted to preserve themselves into the world they had, and everybody else had to be tamed, but basically kept out, right? It's the historical Hellenic xenophobic approach, like, whereas the Romans would literally ethnically engineer with severe demographic colonization the entire chunks, the entire Western Europe began to speak Romance, Latin as a consequence. These words instead had historically an incredibly different view of what properly the imperial Catholic tradition had to be replicated like, and so it's fair, however, to observe that Basil II at the beginning of the 11th century managed to overwhelm so radically Bulgarian power that the Bulgarians would return essentially to an independent political life only at the end of the 12th century, actually before 1204, because already the empire was showing signs of destabilization by that point, and so these provinces began to sort of, also because there was a broader European expansion, so the local elites had become more powerful and autonomous and dangerous, to reactivate in this, again, twisted game of raiding, pillaging, etc. after this gigantic deterrence work over decades of massacres carried out by Basil II in the late 10th and beginning of the 11th century. But, as we've seen in that video about the Second Bulgarian Empire, the actual results, let's say, of this literal eclipse of a Bulgarian empire had, of course, deeply undermined, together with the prevalent feudalization or privatization, at least of Europe in a general sense. In the meanwhile, with the impossibility of reconstructing a sound state of that model that was still available in the High Middle Ages, especially from Constantinople, that still at that point was trying to salvage, in fact, up to Basil II, the idea of the peasant soldiery, the idea of a bureaucracy, of a sort of centralized system, even though, again, this was not like in antiquity anymore. It was heavily degraded and already privatized and eroded and, again, decentralized, but, right, had provided the Bulgarians still with this model to imitate originally, which was a truly civilizational one in which they had even succeeded in establishing, again, one of the greatest powers, European powers of the High Middle Ages. We're talking, in fact, about the First Bulgarian Empire. And in all this, again, I find it quite significant to assess the presence of the Bogomil heresy, because this is not merely, again, a sort of mechanic, geographical proximity of spilling from other neighboring territories, etc. There is a very specific social trigger that brings the commoners to sort of buy into this anti-establishment ideology as a form of resistance, as a form of, we will basically sabotage the empire, we will prevent this. Even the reason, this is the point, right? If the Bulgarian Empire had been solid enough, they could have taken over Constantinople. But these locals didn't want their own elites to actually succeed, even though they would have brought, again, the Balkans to at least the Bulgaria to a much higher level. Then, say, giving up part of their freedom that would have lost anyway in the later centuries, with the same defeat of Bulgaria at the hand of the Byzantines. So this is, you see, every time this sort of populistic ideology kicks in, it's always the same. It's pure self-sabotaging of your own system that has the full potential of making it so to make other enemies win and make you be worse, in spite of the fact that you are the one that is always complaining about, I don't have enough money, I don't want to pay taxes, there's this corrupt elites, and then you destroy the thing and you leave even worse, right? This is what happened historically to every, again, stupid country that, I'm not offending here medieval Bulgaria and the First Bulgarian Empire in the first place, but in generally speaking, the estates that expressed this within it, against the nobility mostly, to eventually end up conquered by other countries. I mean, this is the point. Bulgaria basically lost, aside from the coming back in the 13th century and 14th century, it never reacquired an actual dominance. It had phases of, again, reactivation. At best, we can talk of some specific political territorial control through raids by making nomads from the steppes into the system, sort of diluting, messing up the thing, while other concentrated powers like Serbia, for example, were just, growing better, or eventually the Ottomans took over everything. So in a much more orderly way, by the way. And so a failed state, this is the horrifying history of much of humanity, unfortunately, how to make the imperial Catholic unity fail in the name of your own incapacity, and then complaining the world goes wrong. And so you always have the usual leftistic whining about somebody exploiting you and not being you, just like a parasite fundamentally that is incapable even of making something, right? And just whining because somebody should give you something just because you breathe, right? This is in many ways the history of the world, unfortunately, and it passed through so many. We documented this in so many instances historically, but I think it's particularly meaningful to observe this for Bulgaria. Otherwise, you wouldn't understand why. Normally, on say medieval history manuals, you have just a page or so on the, I don't know, on the Bulgarian Empire. They tell you just, oh look, there was this big empire, it's kind of a big deal, they were like imitating the Byzantines and threatening it, they were this kind of originally from the steppes, but they became Slavic. But who the hell cares? Let's turn page and let's learn something else. Very often about structuralistic, sort of socioeconomic, materialistic, Marxistic bias chapter about the revival of the High Middle Ages, all this stuff, without actually looking at the depths of it. And then you have the chapter on the Cathars, where you will find written, the Cathars had connections with the Bogomils in the Balkans, etc., but they don't explain you why, right? And they also try to sell you the idea that, the Cathars were just a different way of believing Christianity. It's just this terrible church that oppressed everything, and that these guys opposed it, and so the brutal Occitanian crusade, killed everybody, and, they also give you the, normally not, you don't have in the manuals the story, God killed them all, God would recognize their own, which actually was referred as to all these massacres to people who had actually picked up arms against constituted authority, and so of course they would have been massacred, right? This is not just a sadistic, evil bishop that wants to prevent to live your life freely in the 21st century because Christians are bigots or whatever. This is actual, imperial authority destroying heretical rebels that are trying to sabotage like civilization. And violently so, and without any other purpose. It's not that the Pope would have launched a crusade for no reason whatsoever in the heart of Europe on a regular basis. Actually, everybody who had this will not be told in the manuals, but if you look at what the papacy did throughout all the Middle Ages, it was trying to quell wars between Christians all the freaking time, and redirecting the struggle against the enemies of Christianity were actually treading the same boundaries of the same. So this narrative, especially when people tell me that they have an ideology driving, yes, this is an ideology, of course it is an ideology. But if you're not educated enough to understand that the concept of ideology is neutral and that it must be backed with historical evidence, and that it can still be valid, and this is not a preconceived doctrine going against evidence or reality, well, it's your problem, not mine. Right? I earned my titles. I don't have anything to prove. I'm just explaining these to people because they were prevented from developing the actual tools to understand what actually happened historically. So I challenge you to search on the entire YouTube anyone, first of all, talking about this specific topic, like something connecting, even just in conceptual complexity, the rise and fall of the First Bulgarian Empire through this phenomenon, also the endowment of churches, the development of the nobility, the Byzantinization of the same, etc., with, in fact, the Paulician spread and the Bogomils and later Cathars, right? But also that eventually explain you why. This is not a claim. I provided you with a cogent, logical, rational explanation why this thing happens politically, socially, religiously. I mean, it's all there. You can't factually check. There's not the opposite of this in history that you can design. This is what actually happened in any, evidential history that you will find. This is what the phenomenon took the shape and form of, and just here I am pointing it out to you, pointing out even the obvious, telling the truth, that unitly something that is becoming difficult for so many people to do nowadays, because they just think that it's, you have to be, you can't say certain things, you should, you can't truly know because it's complicated. You don't know. You find it complicated. It is complicated, but let's say it's complex, right? Reality is always simpler than it seems, right? Just our own mental deficiency, being scared of the unknown, and so pretending that it's also complicated. If you actually make your job, if you learn how to do something in your life, you will find out the actual deal, and after you read it, it's easy to see the pattern. and appreciating it for the heuristic value that it has, also morally, scientifically, and that's pretty much it. And of course, there is so much more to add, just in general. I mean, how this, the various, I don't know, the development of different libraries across the Byzantine Empire, the Bulgarian one, the difference with the Latin Germanic ones, for example, the same differences in ecclesiastical organization between the East and the West, the Roman influence, I mean, the Arab influences, and so on. So lots of stuff that we have to go forcefully, step by step, in order to fully picture, and you can't really explain the stuff until you make videos of this length and scope, right? And this is essentially what I care about to provide the audience with. For the rest, let's see, how many videos did I make about Bulgaria? Because, again, it's one of those chapters that sadly come up rarely in Bulgarian history. 13 videos, but I don't see... I have 13 videos about Bulgarian history, but medieval Bulgaria has 12. Well, these are just internal problems. Like, I'm not well serious, but again, it's not too much, not so much, but we can definitely appreciate that we made our dozen videos on this, which because I understand why. Because in medieval Bulgaria, I didn't add Volga Bulgaria that I made a video on, and so I differentiated between Bulgarian history and medieval Bulgaria. It's not a mistake, it's really wanted, but I should make another video, another playlist about the Volga Bulgars and the Bulgars in general, because this wouldn't be technically Bulgarian history, it should be Bulgar history, right, in that degree. So sort of complex here. I have to adjust something, but it's just a couple of playlists I have at best to multiply the number. And there is an antipathetic thing, that is to say, I've made so many, because you can make infinite playlists on YouTube, but when there is a space when you upload the new video that allows you to search automatically, like, all the playlists you want this video to go in, just by typing bulk, say, and it will show up immediately well, if you make too many of these playlists and you don't say refill them frequently, they end up in the bottom of the chronology. YouTube won't see some of them, so you will skip, you actually will not insert the video. If you forget about the existence of those other playlists, that you have to insert this video now manually, and in order to make it come to the top and make it occur again, you will have will maybe forget about it and not having the chance to actually distribute properly this video in all in the proper playlist. So that's always a fear of mine now, but I sort of remember what playlists are present or not, so I can immediately guess, also depending on how often I cover a certain topic, whether I have gone under the chronological order, whether they I may be missing them or not. Well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. For today, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.